There is a moment, if you close your eyes and let yourself drift back across the centuries, where you can almost hear it. The slow, deep groan of timber under immense weight. The rhythmic slap of Atlantic swells against the hull. The creak of rigging pulled tight by a warm Caribbean wind. And below decks, resting in iron-bound chests and heavy canvas sacks, stacked against each other in the dark hold of a great galleon, something extraordinary. Silver. Gold. Emeralds pulled from the cold earth of the Andes. Pearls gathered from the trembling hands of enslaved divers. The concentrated wealth of an entire continent, moving slowly across the ocean toward a king who sat 3,000 miles away. This was the Spanish treasure fleet, and for nearly 200 years, there was nothing else like it on Earth. To understand what the treasure fleets truly were, what they meant, what they cost, what they carried, and why so many men were willing to die trying to take them, you have to first understand the scale of what Spain had done. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Spanish conquistadors moved through the Americas like a force of nature. They dismantled the Aztec Empire in Mexico. They toppled the Inca in Peru. And what they found when the dust settled was staggering. The New World was not merely rich. It was incomprehensibly, almost offensively rich. The mines at Potosí, high in the Bolivian Andes at over 13,000 feet above sea level, became the single most productive silver mine the world had ever seen. At its peak, Potosí alone was supplying more than half of all the silver circulating in the entire global economy. Tens of thousands of indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans worked those mines in conditions that defy easy description. Cold, dark, airless, and brutal, pulling silver from the mountain in quantities that could literally reshape the financial order of Europe. But getting that wealth home was its own extraordinary problem. Spain's answer was the floater system, a convoy arrangement that would become one of the most sophisticated and ambitious logistical operations of the age of sail. Twice each year, heavily laden merchant vessels would gather in the great harbor of Seville, and later Cadiz, and set sail westward under the escort of armed warships called galeones de guerra. The fleet would cross the Atlantic, split into divisions, one bound for Veracruz in New Spain, another threading south toward Cartagena and Portobello on the Spanish Main, collect the accumulated silver, gold, and goods from the colonial ports, and then gather again at Havana. It was Havana that served as the great waiting room of empire. Ships would rest there, take on provisions, undergo repairs, and wait for the hurricane season to pass before making the long, dangerous journey back across the Atlantic in a single, united convoy. The wealth that passed through Havana's harbor during those layovers was, at times, almost incomprehensible. A single floater might carry the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars in silver and gold. The crown took its quinto real, the royal fifth, off the top of everything. The rest belonged to merchants, to the church, to private investors, to the colonial administrators who had learned, very quickly, that proximity to the flow of treasure was itself a form of power. And yet, for all its grandeur, this system had a fundamental vulnerability. The ocean is vast, but the routes are not. The flutter followed predictable paths, shaped by wind and current, by the geography of the Caribbean, by the rhythms of the seasons. Any man patient enough and bold enough to wait along those routes with a fast ship and a willing crew could, if fortune smiled on him, claim a prize that would make him wealthy beyond imagination. The Spanish knew this. They spent enormous sums on their escort warships, on coastal fortifications, on intelligence networks designed to track foreign vessels in their waters. They built the great fortresses of Cartagena, of San Juan, of Havana itself, stone walls rising from the water's edge, their cannon trained permanently on the sea. But wealth, like water, tends to find every crack. In the years and decades to come, we will walk slowly through this world together. The sun-hammered docks of Portobello, the smoky taverns of Tortuga, the the quiet strategy rooms of men like Francis Drake and Henry Morgan, who understood the treasure fleet not as an abstraction, but as an opportunity. We will look at the storms that did what pirates could not. We will examine the politics, the greed, the loyalty, and the extraordinary violence that orbited the Spanish treasure system, like planets around a golden sun. Because the story of the treasure fleets is not simply the story of silver and gold. It is the story of an empire trying to hold the world together with rope and cannon, and of the countless men and women on every side who pulled at the ends of that rope until something gave way. The weight of an empire moved slowly across the water, and the wolves were already watching from the shore. Empires are not built on courage alone. They are built on systems. And Spain, for all the romantic chaos we associate with the age of conquistadors, the reckless charges, the audacious gambles, the sheer improbability of a few hundred men toppling civilizations of millions, understood this truth, perhaps better than any nation of its era. Once the dust of conquest had settled, once the gold had been melted down and the silver had begun pouring out of the mountains in quantities that defied easy accounting, the Spanish crown faced a problem that was less dramatic than conquest, but no less demanding. How do you move all of this across an ocean, reliably, year after year for generations, without losing it? The answer they built was called the floater system, and it was, by any honest measure, one of the most ambitious feats of commercial and military organization the early modern world had ever attempted. To appreciate what that meant, you first have to appreciate the geography involved. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was not a single place. It was a vast, sprawling collection of territories stretching from the northern reaches of what is now Mexico, all the way down to the tip of South America. Thousands of miles of coastline, mountain range, jungle, and desert, connected by roads that were rough at best and impassable at worst. Silver came out of the mines at Potosi in the high Andes, and had to be carried by llama train down to the Pacific coast, loaded onto ships, sailed north to Panama, hauled overland across the isthmus on the backs of mules, and then loaded again onto Atlantic vessels at the port of Portobello. Gold from New Granada moved through Cartagena. Cochineal, indigo, cacao, and hides came out of New Spain through Veracruz. Each product, each port, each overland route was its own logistical puzzle, requiring its own administrators, its own guards, its own schedule. All of this eventually funneled toward Havana. The city of Havana occupies one of the finest natural harbors in the entire Caribbean, deep, sheltered, easily defended, positioned almost perfectly at the mouth of the Florida Straits, through which the Gulf Stream flows northeastward toward the open Atlantic. Spanish navigators had understood the strategic value of this geography, almost from the moment they first charted these waters. The Gulf Stream was not merely a current, it was a highway. A ship riding the stream northward out of Havana could pick up speed and favorable winds that would carry it toward the Azores, and then onto Spain in a fraction of the time it would take by any other route. Havana was, therefore, not simply a port of call. It was the keystone of the entire Atlantic trading system. Twice each year, in rough terms, a spring sailing and a late summer sailing, carefully timed around the hurricane season. The fleet would divide into its two great branches. The first, called the Flota de Nueva España, sailed toward Veracruz on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where it collected the products of New Spain and the goods that had been carried up from the Philippines via the Great Manila Galleon route across the Pacific. The second branch, known as the Galeones de Tierra Firme, sailed south toward the Spanish Main, stopping at Cartagena in what is now Colombia, and then continuing to the small, sweltering port of Portobello on the coast of Panama, where the silver of Peru and the Andes waited in warehouses along the waterfront. Portobello deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the stranger and more fascinating places in the entire story of the treasure fleets. For most of the year, It was a quiet, unhealthy little town, humid, malarial, commercially insignificant. But when the Galeones arrived, it transformed almost overnight into one of the busiest and wealthiest trading posts on Earth. A great fair would erupt along its waterfront, merchants arriving from across the Americas and from Spain, buying and selling at a pace and volume that stunned even experienced travelers. Silver would be stacked openly in the streets, in quantities that seemed almost theatrical. Contemporary accounts describe the scene with barely contained astonishment. Bars of silver used as casual seating, fortunes changing hands in the open air, the atmosphere equal parts marketplace and carnival. And then, as quickly as it had ignited, the fair would end. The silver would be loaded, the ships would depart, and Portobello would sink quietly back into the torpor of the tropics. Once both branches of the fleet had completed their collections, they would rendezvous at Havana. This was where the true weight of the operation could be felt. Ships riding low in the water with their cargo, sailors and officers drinking, quarreling, gambling, and repairing rigging in the steaming heat of the Cuban summer. Merchants counting and recounting their manifests, royal officials tallying the quinto real, the 20% tax the crown extracted from every ounce of silver and gold that passed through its hands. The harbor would be crowded to a degree difficult to imagine, with vessels of every size clustered around the galleons like satellites around a planet. And presiding over all of it was the institution that gave the entire system its legal and administrative backbone, the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, established in Seville in 53, and arguably the most powerful commercial regulatory body in the world for much of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Casa controlled everything. It licensed merchants. It approved ship designs and inspected vessels for seaworthiness. It maintained the official registry of all cargo moving between Spain and the Americas. The registro, which served as the legal record of who owned what and what the crown was owed. It trained navigators and certified their competence. It settled commercial disputes. It investigated losses and adjudicated claims, and it maintained, with considerable vigilance, the Spanish crown's determination to keep the entire Atlantic trade system as a closed, exclusive monopoly. No foreign ships, no foreign merchants, no unauthorized trade of any kind. That monopoly was, of course, never fully enforced. The empire was too large, the coastline too long, the temptation too great. Smuggling was endemic. Corrupt officials could be paid to look the other way, and frequently were. But the Casa created, at minimum, a framework of accountability that meant the crown always had some sense of what was moving, who owned it, and what it was worth. The ships themselves are worth pausing on. The galleons that formed the backbone of the treasure fleet were remarkable vessels, large, heavily built, designed to carry enormous quantities of cargo while also mounting enough cannon to defend themselves. A typical galleon of the mid-16th century might be anywhere from 300 to 500 tons, with 4 decks, multiple gun ports on each broadside, and a crew of several hundred men. They were not fast ships. They were not meant to be. Speed was sacrificed for capacity and durability. A galleon was built to survive the open Atlantic in storm, to carry more silver than most men would ever see in their lifetimes, and to absorb punishment from an enemy's cannon long enough for help to arrive or for nightfall to provide an escape. The escort warships, the galeones de guerra, were somewhat different in character. Lighter in cargo, heavier in armament, they sailed at the edges of the convoy, their gun crews ready, their officers scanning the horizon for the silhouette of an unfamiliar sail. The number of escorts varied enormously over the decades, depending on the political situation in Europe, the threat level in the Caribbean, and the financial state of the crown, which was often strained to near breaking point even as rivers of silver flowed through its hands. Spain's problem, one of the great ironies of the age, was that the more silver it extracted from the Americas, the more it spent. On wars in Europe, on the maintenance of its vast bureaucracy, on the interest payments on debts that accumulated faster than even the mines of Potosi could retire them. The treasure fleet made Spain rich. It also made Spain dependent. And dependence on a system as vulnerable as an ocean convoy was a fragility that Spain's enemies were very keen to exploit. The scheduling of the fleets was itself a form of protection. By sailing in convoy rather than individually, the Spanish dramatically reduced the risk to any single vessel. A pirate or privateer willing to attack a lone merchant ship might think twice, or 3 times, before engaging a convoy of 20 or 30 vessels with a half-dozen armed warships in company. The mathematics of violence shifted considerably when the odds were no longer in the attacker's favor, and yet the convoy system created its own problems. Ships had to wait for one another, sometimes for weeks or months, in harbor. Cargo sat in warehouses growing damp and drawing the attention of anyone with sharp eyes and flexible ethics. Departure dates, however carefully guarded, had a way of becoming known. To merchants who needed to plan, to officials who needed to arrange transport, and inevitably to men waiting in the shadows of the Caribbean with their own very particular plans. There was also the matter of the storms. The Caribbean hurricane season runs from June through November, and the Spanish were well aware that nature could accomplish in an afternoon what no pirate fleet could manage in a year. The timing of the floater was calibrated as carefully as the technology of the era allowed to avoid the worst of the season. But the ocean did not always cooperate. Hurricanes were imprecisely predicted, unexpectedly powerful, and capable of scattering or destroying a convoy with a thoroughness that left no room for heroism. Some of the greatest losses the treasure fleet ever suffered came not from enemy action at all, but from the indifferent violence of wind and water. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The greatest naval power of the age, with its carefully designed ships and its armed escorts and its royal regulations and its ancient administrative institution in Seville, all of it could be undone in an afternoon by the weather. The sea was never entirely tamed, and the men who understood that, who watched the patterns of wind and storm, who knew when a fleet would be at its most vulnerable, its crews exhausted, and its formations scattered, those men were already making their own calculations. Not all of them worked for the Spanish crown, and not all of them were, strictly speaking, pirates. But we will get to that distinction in due course, because the line between a privateer and a pirate, between a patriot and a criminal, between a sanctioned raider and an outlaw of the sea, was one of the most interesting and consequential lines of the entire age, and the treasure fleets sat directly on both sides of it. For now, let the image settle. The great convoy gathering in Havana harbor, the silver stacked in the holds, the escort warships riding at anchor with their gun ports open to the warm air, and somewhere beyond the horizon, eyes watching and waiting. The architecture of empire was impressive, but nothing built by human hands is without its cracks. Before a single coin was ever loaded onto a galleon, before a single chest was ever carried down the gangplank at Seville, before the treasure fleet was anything more than an idea in the minds of Spanish administrators, there was the earth itself. And the earth, in the Americas, gave up its wealth only under extraordinary pressure. To truly understand the treasure fleets, not merely as a commercial and military phenomenon, but as a human one, you have to go back to the source. You have to go to the mountains. You have to go to the places where the silver and gold were pulled from the rock by the hands of men and women who had no choice in the matter, who worked in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance, and whose labor made possible the entire magnificent and terrible machinery of the Spanish Atlantic Empire. Without them, there is no treasure. Without the treasure, there is no fleet. Without the fleet, the history of the early modern world looks entirely different. These are not peripheral figures in this story. They are, in a very real sense, its foundation, the most important of all, the mining sites. The one whose name became synonymous, across Europe and the Americas alike, with almost incomprehensible mineral wealth, was a mountain in what is now Bolivia. The Spanish called it the Cerro Rico, the rich hill. It rose above the high Andean plain at an altitude that left newcomers breathless and dizzy, simply from the effort of standing still, and within its flanks it contained one of the largest concentrations of silver ore ever discovered on Earth. The city that grew up beneath it, Potosí, swelled over the course of the 16th century from nothing into one of the largest urban centers in the entire world. By 1600, Potosí had a population of roughly 150,000 people, larger than London at the time, larger than Madrid, larger than almost any city in Europe. It was a city built entirely on silver, sustained entirely by silver, and animated by the peculiar, feverish energy of a place where enormous wealth and enormous suffering occupy exactly the same space. The labor that powered Potosí operated under a system the Spanish inherited and expanded from Inca tradition, called the mita. Under the mita, indigenous communities across a vast region of the Andes were required to send a portion of their male population, typically 1 in 7 adult men, to work in the mines for a period of 1 year. In theory, these workers were compensated. In practice, the compensation was so meager, the conditions so dangerous, and the demands so relentless that the mita functioned, in all practical terms, as forced labor. Men descended into the mountain through narrow, suffocating shafts, working by candlelight in air thick with dust and mercury fumes, chipping ore from the rock face with iron tools, carrying it out on their backs in heavy leather sacks. The ascent from the deepest levels of the mine could take several hours. Workers might spend entire shifts underground without returning to the surface. Many never returned at all. Mercury was central to the process, and its role in the story of Potosí deserves careful attention. In 1554, a process called amalgamation was introduced to the silver refining operations of the Americas, a technique in which crushed silver ore was mixed with liquid mercury, which bonded chemically with the silver and allowed it to be separated from the surrounding rock with far greater efficiency than previous methods. The results were transformative. Silver production increased dramatically almost overnight. The mercury mine at Huancavelica in Peru, which supplied Potosí with the chemical it needed, became the second most important mine in the Americas, and the labor conditions there were, if anything, worse than at Potosí itself. Mercury poisoning was endemic among the workers, a slow neurological deterioration that produced tremors, memory loss, and eventually death. Workers who spent years in the refineries could be identified by the damage the mercury had done to their bodies. They were, in the language of the era, being consumed by the work. Historians have spent considerable time attempting to quantify the human cost of the Potosí mines. The numbers are difficult to establish with precision, and they vary considerably between scholarly estimates. But the weight of the evidence suggests that over the roughly 2 centuries of the mita system's most intense operation, the mortality rate among indigenous workers was catastrophic, not simply from mining accidents and mercury poisoning, but from the disruption to agricultural communities, the collapse of traditional social structures, the diseases that spread through the crowded conditions of the mining camps, and the sheer physical toll of high-altitude labor under conditions of severe deprivation. The Spanish phrase that circulated in the colonial period, vale un Potosí, meaning something worth a Potosí, a shorthand for incalculable value, captures something real about how the Spanish saw the mountain. It captures rather less about what the mountain cost. Not all the wealth of the New World came from silver. Gold occupied its own important place in the story, particularly in the early decades of the conquest and in the territories of what is now Colombia and Panama. The legend of El Dorado, the Golden Man, the Golden City, the kingdom of impossible riches somewhere in the interior of South America, drove Spanish expeditions into jungles and mountains for generations, costing lives and fortunes in pursuit of a rumor that never quite resolved into reality. But the gold that actually existed in the rivers and alluvial deposits of New Granada was real enough. Cartagena de Indias, founded in 1533 on the Caribbean coast of what is now Colombia, became the primary port through which this gold moved, and the city accumulated, over time, a physical and symbolic weight that made it one of the most contested and most attacked cities in the entire Americas. Once the ore had been extracted from the earth, it had to be transformed into something portable, standardized, and officially certified before it could enter the formal economy of the empire. This was the function of the mint, the Casa de Moneda, and the Spanish established these institutions at key points throughout their American territories. The mint at Potosi was among the most important. There, silver ore was smelted, refined, and cast into bars or struck into coins in a process that was theoretically meticulous and officially regulated at every stage. The coins produced the famous reales de a ocho, the pieces of 8 that would become the most recognized currency in the world for the next 2 centuries, were supposed to meet exacting standards of weight and purity before being stamped with the royal seal and entered into the official register. In practice, the mints were also among the most reliably corrupt institutions in the entire colonial system. The opportunity for fraud was considerable, and it was frequently taken. Assayers could be bribed to certify underweight or impure coins. Officials could skim silver from the smelting process. Workers could conceal small amounts of ore or refined metal in ingenious ways, swallowed, hidden in clothing, embedded in ordinary-looking objects. A practice so common that it had its own name and its own elaborate countermeasures. The Potosi mint scandal of 1649 is perhaps the most dramatic example. An investigation revealed that the mint had, for years, been systematically producing coins of significantly less than their certified silver content, with the knowledge and participation of officials at multiple levels of the administration. The fraud had gone on long enough and involved enough people that unraveling it required extensive investigation and produced executions, imprisonments, and a fundamental reorganization of the mint's operations. The silver that survived this gauntlet, the ore extracted, the workers who extracted it, consumed in the process, the coins certified and registered and loaded into strong boxes. Then began its long journey toward the sea. From Potosi, silver bars traveled by llama train down from the high plateau to the Pacific port of Arica, and from there by ship northward to Callao, the port of Lima, which served as the administrative capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Lima itself was a city of considerable grandeur by the mid-17th century. Cathedral, university, palaces of the colonial elite, built and maintained on the silver flowing through it. From Callao, the treasure continued north by sea to Panama City on the Pacific coast, where it was unloaded and the famous Camino Real, the Royal Road, began. The Camino Real was a mule track essentially, though one of enormous strategic importance. It crossed the Isthmus of Panama from the Pacific coast to the Caribbean, in a journey of roughly 50 miles that could take several days, through humid jungle, across rivers that rose unpredictably, under a sun that made the work of the mule drivers and guards a constant, exhausting battle against the climate. The silver moved in mule trains of considerable size, guarded by soldiers who understood that the trail through the jungle was one of the most dangerous corridors in the empire, not merely because of the terrain, but because it had been identified, very early, as a point of extraordinary vulnerability. A man who could intercept the silver on the Camino Real did not need to face the guns of a galleon. He needed only the jungle, the right information, and enough armed men willing to share the risk. We will return to that trail, and to the men who walked it with very different intentions from the mule drivers. But, for now, follow the silver to its destination on the Caribbean side, the small, fever-ridden port of Portobello, where the treasure accumulated in warehouses along the waterfront, guarded by the walls of the forts that rose above the harbor entrance, waiting for the sound of sails on the horizon that meant the galeones had arrived. There is something almost meditative, if you allow yourself to slow down and feel it, about the sheer distance this wealth traveled before it ever touched the sea lanes where pirates waited. Mountains to coast, Pacific to isthmus, trail through jungle, Caribbean warehouse, then the harbor, then the open ocean, then the long Atlantic crossing, then the river mouth at Seville, thousands of miles, years sometimes, between the moment the ore came out of the rock and the moment the coin landed in a merchant's hand in Madrid or Antwerp or Amsterdam, and at every stage of that journey, human hands, human decisions, human suffering and human ingenuity and human greed. The gold was never simply gold. It was always also a story, a long, complicated, and frequently very dark story, told in the language of labor and logistics, of corruption and catastrophe, of men and women who lived and died in the service of a system whose beneficiaries were rarely the people doing the heaviest work. The weight of the empire, as we said at the beginning, moved slowly across the water, but the weight had been placed, first and always, on the shoulders of those closest to the earth. There is a distinction that matters enormously in the history of the treasure fleets, and it is one that tends to get lost in the romance of the subject, buried beneath the imagery of black flags and cutlasses and men swinging from rigging with knives between their teeth. The distinction is a legal one, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a distinction that could mean the difference between a hero's welcome in an English port and a hanging at Execution Dock on the banks of the Thames. The distinction is this: a privateer carried a piece of paper, a pirate did not. That piece of paper was called a letter of marque, a commission issued by a sovereign government authorizing a privately owned ship and its captain to attack and seize the vessels of an enemy nation. A privateer was, in essence, a licensed predator. He was a businessman of violence, operating within a legal framework that allowed him to keep a portion of whatever he captured while his sponsoring government took its share and enjoyed the strategic benefits of harassing an enemy's commerce without the expense of maintaining a formal navy. The privateer was deniable, economical, and often extraordinarily effective. He was also, from the Spanish perspective, utterly indistinguishable in practice from a common pirate, because whether the man boarding your ship with a sword in his hand has a letter of marque in his coat pocket or not, the silver in your hold goes with him either way. The treasure fleets, precisely because of their wealth and their predictability, attracted both kinds of men in abundance, and understanding who they were, where they came from, what motivated them, and how they operated is essential to understanding the full shape of this story. Let us begin with the privateers, because they came first, and because the greatest of them cast shadows long enough to define the entire era. Francis Drake was not, by the standards of his own time, a pirate. He was an Englishman, a Protestant, a servant of the crown, and a man of considerable navigational genius who understood the geography of the Spanish Main with an intimacy that few of his contemporaries could match. He was also, from the Spanish perspective, a thief and a murderer, and the fact that Queen Elizabeth had given him her blessing did nothing whatsoever to soften that assessment. Drake had grown up in a seafaring family in Devon, had gone to sea young, and had received his education in the realities of Spanish power the hard way. At the Battle of San Juan de Ulua in 1568, where a Spanish fleet attacked and largely destroyed an English expedition that had sought refuge in a Mexican port under a flag of truce, Drake was among the survivors. He did not forget what he had seen, and he spent the rest of his career making certain that the Spanish did not forget him. His 5072 raid on the Camino Real, the very trail we followed in the previous segment, through the jungle of Panama, was a masterpiece of intelligence gathering, patience, and audacity. Drake had spent months in the Caribbean beforehand, making contact with the Cimarrones, communities of escaped African slaves who had built their own free settlements in the Panamanian jungle and who had very powerful reasons of their own to damage the Spanish colonial system. With their knowledge of the terrain and their help in planning the operation, Drake positioned his men along the trail and waited. The mule train arrived. The attack was swift, and Drake walked away with enough silver to make every man in his crew wealthy, though the full haul was ultimately less than he had hoped for, because some of it had to be buried and abandoned in the chaos of the withdrawal. What the raid demonstrated, beyond its immediate material result, was something more significant. The treasure route was vulnerable. The jungle trail, the warehouses at Portobello, the layover at Havana. All of these were soft points in a system that projected an image of impenetrability it did not entirely deserve. Drake understood this, and the captains who came after him understood it too. Drake's 1585 expedition to the Caribbean was on an entirely different scale. A fleet of over 20 ships, more than 2,000 men, operating with explicit royal authorization and strategic objectives that went far beyond simple plunder. He sacked Santo Domingo, the oldest European city in the Americas. He took Cartagena, holding it for ransom, and causing a financial and psychological shock to the Spanish colonial system that reverberated all the way to Madrid. He did not capture a treasure fleet on that voyage. The timing did not align, but he demonstrated comprehensively that no city on the Spanish Main was beyond reach if sufficient force was brought to bear. The Spanish spent the years afterward fortifying their ports with a new urgency that they had not felt before. Drake made his intentions so emphatically clear. If Drake represents the privateer at his most strategically sophisticated, a man who thought in terms of campaigns and geopolitical consequences as much as immediate profit, then the career of Henry Morgan represents something rather different. Morgan operated in the latter half of the 17th century, when the age of the great privateering expeditions had given way to a murkier world of semi-official raiding, colonial politics, and the peculiar culture of the buccaneers. The rough, self-governing brotherhood of hunters and sailors who had established themselves on the island of Tortuga and the western coast of Hispaniola, and who formed the essential human material of Caribbean raiding for several generations. Morgan was Welsh, tough, politically astute, and possessed of a talent for leadership that inspired the kind of loyalty from desperate men that is very difficult to manufacture artificially. He had come to the Caribbean in the 1650s, made his way into the buccaneer world, and risen through a combination of competence, nerve, and an instinctive understanding of how to manage the volatile coalitions of men that large raiding expeditions required. His assault on Portobello in 1668, that same sweltering port where the treasure accumulated in its waterfront warehouses, was planned and executed with a directness that was almost contemptuous of the Spanish defenses. He attacked the forts from the landward side, where the guns were not trained. He moved at night. He was inside the walls before the garrison had fully understood what was happening. Morgan held Portobello for weeks, extracting a ransom from the surrounding colonial government before withdrawing with a haul that made his investors, and himself, extremely comfortable. His 1671 crossing of the Panama Isthmus and sack of Panama City itself was the most ambitious overland raid in the history of Caribbean privateering. He moved nearly 1,200 men through the jungle, fought a pitched battle outside the city, and sacked one of the most important administrative centers in the entire Spanish Empire. It was an act of such breathtaking scale that even his own sponsors in Jamaica were uncertain how to respond to it, particularly since the raid occurred after England and Spain had technically concluded a peace treaty, a piece of news that had apparently not reached Morgan or had reached him and been judged insufficiently compelling. Morgan was arrested and sent to England to face potential prosecution. He was instead knighted and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The line between privateer and statesman, it turned out, was in some cases thinner even than the line between privateer and pirate. But not all the men who hunted the treasure fleets operated with the organizational resources of a Drake or a Morgan, or the political connections that could transform a technically criminal act into a retrospectively authorized one. The Caribbean in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was home to a broader and more chaotic world of piracy that operated entirely outside any legal framework. Men who had perhaps started as privateers or buccaneers, but who had cut their ties to any sponsoring authority and now sailed under their own flag, for their own account, taking whatever they could from whoever was available. These were the men who inhabited Tortuga, and later Nassau in the Bahamas, the towns that served as the informal capitals of what historians sometimes call the Golden Age of piracy, roughly spanning the 1680s to the 1720s. Nassau in particular, in the years after 1700, became a place of extraordinary social complexity. A community where former privateers, escaped indentured servants, runaway slaves, naval deserters, and men simply fleeing the constraints of European society, constructed something that was, in its own strange way, a functioning alternative social order. The rule of law was minimal. The social hierarchy of the old world was, at least in theory, irrelevant. What mattered was your ship, your crew, your reputation, and your willingness to take risks that sober men would decline. The men who sailed from Nassau, Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Bartholomew Roberts, Calico Jack Rackham, are the figures whose names have become most thoroughly embedded in popular imagination, and their stories are genuinely remarkable, full of violence and audacity, and the kind of behavioral extremity that tends to fix itself in memory. But it is worth noting, as we think about them in the context of the treasure fleet specifically, that these were not, for the most part, men who regularly engaged Spanish convoys directly. The Golden Age pirates were opportunists rather than strategists. They took merchant vessels, logwood ships, slave vessels, coastal traders, targets that were accessible and lightly defended. The treasure fleet, with its armed escorts and its concentrated firepower, was a different proposition entirely from a lone merchant brig becalmed in the Florida Straits. The men who actually came closest to the treasure fleet, who engaged it directly, disrupted it seriously, and in some cases took pieces of it, were more often the state-sponsored operators, the Drakes and Morgans and their Dutch and French equivalents, who brought enough force and enough intelligence to make the attempt viable. The lone pirate attacking a galleon is one of the most durable images in popular history. It is also, for the most part, a fantasy. The galleons were not helpless. They were heavily armed, heavily crewed, and surrounded by warships. Taking one required something closer to a naval operation than an act of individual daring, which is not to say it never happened, because it did. And when it did, the results were extraordinary enough to pass into legend, and to confirm, in the minds of every desperate, ambitious, and reckless man in the Caribbean, that the prize was real, the dream was possible, and the fleet, for all its guns and all its escorts, was not entirely beyond reach. The wolves on the water came in many forms. Some wore crowns in their pockets. Some wore nothing but their own hunger and the wind at their backs. All of them were watching the same horizon. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a stretch of ocean after a storm has passed through it, not the comfortable silence of a calm day, with its gentle swells and its distant birdsong, and the creak of a ship riding easily at anchor. This is a different silence altogether, heavier, more charged, the silence of aftermath, the kind that follows violence. The surface of the water, still disturbed and restless from the wind that drove it, littered with the debris of things that were whole, not many hours before: broken timber, shredded canvas, ropes still knotted to nothing, personal objects, a boot, a rosary, a carpenter's tool, drifting in slow, purposeless circles on the current, and somewhere below, settling into the sand and the coral in the green dark water, the weight of an empire going nowhere at all. The sea took more treasure from Spain than any privateer, any pirate, any foreign navy ever managed to seize. This is not a controversial historical claim. It is simply devastatingly true. The hurricanes of the Caribbean and the storms of the North Atlantic were indifferent to the careful calculations of the Casa de Contratación, to the engineering of the galleons, to the prayers offered by sailors clutching their rosaries as the wind rose and the sky turned the color of old iron. They struck when and where they chose, and when they struck a fully laden treasure fleet at sea, the results could be catastrophic on a scale that no human enemy could replicate. To understand why, you have to understand something about the physics of a heavily loaded galleon in heavy weather. These were large ships, but not infinitely large, and the cargo they carried, silver bars, coin chests, cannon, provisions, trade goods, sat low in the hold and made them less responsive to the helm than a lightly loaded vessel. A galleon riding deep in the water with a full cargo of silver had reduced freeboard. The distance between the waterline and the deck, which meant that waves washing over the hull were a constant threat. The pumps, worked by exhausted men around the clock in bad weather, could keep pace with minor leaking. They could not keep pace with the sea pouring through a sprung hull plank or a shattered gun port. And the Caribbean in summer and autumn is not a forgiving place. The hurricane season that runs through those months is one of the most powerful meteorological phenomena on Earth, capable of generating sustained winds that would be unimaginable to anyone who has not experienced them. Walls of air moving at speeds that can strip the rigging from a ship in minutes, drive the vessel sideways through the water with no meaningful control possible, push the ocean itself into surges that overwhelm any coastline in their path. The Spanish knew the season well. They planned around it as carefully as the technology of weather prediction in the 17th century allowed, which was not, by any modern standard, particularly carefully at all. They watched the signs, the particular quality of the swell, the behavior of certain birds, the color of the sky at evening, and they made their best judgments about when it was safe to sail. They were wrong, often enough to fill the bottom of the sea with silver. The hurricane of 1622 is perhaps the most consequential single storm in the history of the treasure fleets, and it is worth sitting with it in some detail, because it illustrates with terrible precision what the sea could do when it decided to assert itself against the best efforts of human organization. The Tierra Firme fleet of that year was already running late. It was September, later in the sailing season than the Spanish preferred. When the convoy finally departed, Havana with a full cargo, heading northward through the Florida Straits to catch the Gulf Stream that would carry it towards the Azores and home. The fleet consisted of 28 ships. Among them were two that carried the greatest concentration of registered treasure, the Nuestra Señora de Atocha and the Santa Margarita. Between them, these two galleons carried hundreds of thousands of silver coins, silver bars numbering in the thousands, gold bars and chains, copper ingots, tobacco, indigo, and a quantity of contraband cargo that was not on any official manifest. The inevitable consequence of a system in which smuggling had become so normalized that it was practically an additional line of business. The storm found them, the morning after their departure from Havana, in the shallow waters of the Florida Keys, the worst possible location. Deep water gives a ship room to maneuver, room to ride out a storm by heaving to and letting the vessel find its own accommodation with the sea. Shallow water, with its reefs and its sandbars and its coral heads rising toward the surface, offers no such accommodation. A ship driven onto a reef in a hurricane is not damaged. It is destroyed. The Atocha struck bottom in the chaos of the storm and broke apart. Of the roughly 260 people aboard, sailors, soldiers, passengers, enslaved people, only 5 survived, clinging to wreckage as the storm gradually exhausted itself. The Santa Margarita fared somewhat better in the immediate term, driving onto a sandbar rather than a reef, which at least left part of the hull intact, but it too was lost. 8 other ships from the convoy were destroyed or damaged beyond salvage in the same storm. The total loss in registered treasure alone was staggering, and the contraband, by definition unrecorded, added an unknown additional sum to the total. The Spanish did not simply accept this loss and move on. They mounted salvage operations almost immediately, using indigenous and enslaved divers to locate and recover what they could from the wrecks. The Santa Margarita yielded significant amounts of silver in the weeks and months after the storm. The sandbar location made it accessible to divers working from the surface. The Atocha was more elusive, having broken into pieces and scattered its cargo across a wider area of the seafloor, and despite determined efforts over the following years, the Spanish were never able to recover the bulk of its treasure. The Atocha slipped into the category of lost things, present in the records, present in the memory of the empire, but physically inaccessible and eventually forgotten beneath the shifting sands. It would remain there for 361 years, until a treasure hunter from Indiana named Mel Fisher, after 16 years of searching and the loss of his own son and daughter-in-law in a diving accident, found the main cargo in 1985. A discovery that produced one of the most significant collections of 17th century artifacts ever recovered from the ocean floor, and reignited, for a generation, the romance of sunken Spanish treasure. But the 1622 hurricane, devastating as it was, is far from the only entry in this catalogue of maritime catastrophe. The 1715 Plate Fleet disaster stands alongside it as one of the great tragedies of the treasure fleet era, and it occupies a particularly poignant place in the history of Spanish colonial wealth, because it came at a moment when the empire was already weakened and the loss could be least afforded. The War of the Spanish Succession had consumed Spain for over a decade, draining its treasury, disrupting its Atlantic trade, and leaving the colonial system starved of the regular communication and commerce it needed to function smoothly. The 1715 fleet. 11 ships carrying an enormous accumulation of silver and gold that had built up in the colonial ports during years of disrupted sailings, represented, in a sense, the deferred wealth of an entire decade finally making its way home. The fleet departed Havana on July 24, 1715, in weather that seemed acceptable. The captains were aware of the season's risks, but judged the conditions manageable. They were catastrophically wrong. Within 2 days of departure, a hurricane of exceptional violence caught the fleet off the east coast of Florida, driving it onto the shallow reefs and sandbars of that coast with a completeness that left almost no ship intact. 10 of the 11 vessels were lost. Roughly 1,000 people drowned. The registered treasure, silver and gold worth millions of pesos, disappeared into the shallow coastal waters of what is now the Treasure Coast of Florida, a name that preserves, in the modern geography of the American Southeast, the memory of that single terrible night. The lone surviving ship, a French vessel called the Griffon, which had been sailing in company with the Spanish fleet, managed to ride out the storm and eventually reached port, carrying with it the news of what had happened and the first Spanish survivors to reach safety. The rescue operations that followed were extensive, and the Spanish did manage to recover a significant portion of the lost treasure through immediate salvage efforts, using the same combination of indigenous and enslaved divers that had been employed a century earlier after the 1622 disaster. But much remained on the seabed, and the losses came at a moment that the Spanish Empire could absorb them least. The war had ended just months before, and the treasure had been desperately needed to begin the process of financial reconstruction. There is a further dimension to these shipwreck disasters that tends to get overlooked in accounts focused primarily on the treasure itself, and it is worth pausing on it here. The human lives lost in these storms were not only the sailors and soldiers and wealthy passengers whose names sometimes appear in the records. They included the enslaved people who were routinely transported aboard the treasure fleet ships, Africans and indigenous people who appear in the historical record, if they appear at all, as cargo rather than as individuals. Their deaths in these disasters were real, and they were numerous, and the silence around them in the contemporary accounts tells its own uncomfortable story about whose lives were considered worth recording and whose were not. The wrecks themselves, scattered along the coasts of Florida and the Florida Keys and the Bahamas and the shallow waters of the Caribbean, became in the decades and centuries after their sinking a kind of secondary economy of their own. Spanish salvagers worked them for years. Pirates and fishermen picked over the shallower sites for whatever the official salvagers had missed. Local populations along the Florida coast learned which beaches yielded silver coins after storms had stirred the bottom, a knowledge passed down through generations long after the origin of the coins had been forgotten. And eventually, in the 20th century, the treasure hunters came with their sophisticated equipment and their legal battles over salvage rights and their extraordinary finds. The Atocha's emeralds and gold chains, the 1715 FLEETS coins still washing up on Florida beaches after 300 years of tides, the slow, ongoing archaeology of a catastrophe that the sea has never entirely finished giving back. The storms took what no pirate could. They took it quickly, completely, and with the absolute indifference of something that has no interest in empire, no understanding of wealth, and no preference between a king's silver and a drowned sailor's boot. Both go to the bottom equally. Both rest there in the same silence, the silence that follows when the wind has finally stopped and the sea, having done what it came to do, settles gradually back into something that looks, from a distance, almost like calm. Empires do not usually end the way battles do. There is no single cannon shot, no decisive charge, no moment where one side raises a flag and the other lowers theirs, and everyone agrees that something has concluded. Empires tend to end the way great trees fall in old forests. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, with internal rot working its way outward through the rings while the bark still looks solid from a distance. And then, one season, the weight of what has accumulated becomes more than the structure can bear, and something that seemed permanent reveals itself to have been, all along, merely durable. The Spanish treasure fleet system was durable for an extraordinary length of time. For nearly 2 centuries it functioned, imperfectly, expensively, corruptly, at enormous human cost, periodically disrupted by storms and raiders, and the chaos of European warfare. But it functioned. Silver crossed the Atlantic, the crown received its revenue, the merchants of Seville and Cadiz prospered, the colonial ports grew. The system was battered again and again, and again and again it recovered, because the underlying logic of it remained sound as long as the mines kept producing and the ships kept sailing, and no rival power managed to permanently sever the connection between the New World and the Old. But nothing lasts forever, and by the early decades of the 18th century, the conditions that had made the treasure fleet system not merely possible but necessary were beginning to change in ways that no amount of administrative reform or military spending could reverse. The first, and perhaps most fundamental of these changes, was geological, and it had been building for generations before anyone in Madrid fully understood its implications. The great mines were running out, not all at once, and not completely. Silver continued to come out of the Andes for centuries after the peak of the treasure fleet era. But the extraordinary, almost geological abundance that had characterized the Potosi mines in their prime was a finite thing. The richest and most accessible ore bodies had been worked hardest and earliest, and by the late 17th century, miners were having to go deeper and work harder for diminishing returns. The mercury amalgamation process that had dramatically increased production a century and a half earlier could not compensate indefinitely for ore that was simply less silver-rich than what earlier generations of miners had enjoyed. Output fell. The volume of treasure available to load onto the galleons declined, and as it declined, the economic rationale for maintaining the elaborate and expensive convoy system, with its armed escorts, its administrative superstructure, its seasonal scheduling, its enormous logistical demands, became progressively harder to justify against the cost. The second change was financial, and it was intimately connected to something that the Spanish had never fully managed to address throughout the entire history of the treasure fleet: the paradox of silver wealth. Spain had, for 2 centuries, been the conduit through which American silver flowed into the European and global economy. But being the conduit is not the same as being the destination. An enormous proportion of the silver that entered Spain from the Americas departed again almost immediately, flowing to the Italian bankers who financed Spanish military campaigns, to the Dutch merchants who supplied Spanish markets with manufactured goods, to the German mining interests that supplied technical expertise, to the English and French traders who found their way into Spanish colonial markets through a combination of legitimate commerce and outright smuggling. Spain was, in the memorable formulation of one contemporary observer, a mouth through which wealth flowed but did not stay. The result was that by the early 18th century, Spain was simultaneously the nation that had extracted more silver from the earth than any other in history, and a nation that was effectively bankrupt, carrying debts that its revenues could not service, maintaining military commitments that its economy could not support, and watching the financial power of Europe migrate northward and westward toward the Protestant commercial states of England and the Dutch Republic, whose economic models were based less on the extraction of colonial wealth and more on the circulation, investment, and multiplication of capital through trade and finance. The War of the Spanish Succession, which convulsed Europe between 1701 and 1714, was the moment when these structural weaknesses became impossible to ignore. The war was fought over who would sit on the Spanish throne following the death of the childless King Charles II, a conflict that drew in virtually every major European power and produced more than a decade of sustained, expensive, destructive warfare on land and sea. For the treasure fleet system, the war was catastrophic in multiple ways simultaneously. English and Dutch naval forces, now operating as belligerents against Spain rather than simply as unauthorized raiders, made the Atlantic crossing significantly more dangerous. Several treasure fleets were delayed, rerouted, or cancelled entirely during the war years, causing the accumulation of unshipped colonial wealth that would eventually produce the disastrous 1715 fleet and its catastrophic loss in the Florida hurricane. The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war in 1713, introduced a change that cut to the heart of the old fleet system in a way that no storm or pirate raid had ever managed. Among its provisions was the Asiento, a contract granting Britain the right to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies, and alongside it, the right to send 1 ship per year carrying general merchandise to trade in the Spanish-American ports. The Navío de Permiso, as this annual ship was called, was in theory a modest concession. In practice, it became the wedge through which British commercial interests began to pry open the Spanish colonial monopoly that the Casa de Contratación had maintained for 2 centuries. The ship was restocked at sea from tender vessels that kept it perpetually supplied with fresh cargo, allowing it to function as a continuous commercial presence rather than a single annual event. The monopoly was not shattered overnight, but it was visibly cracking. At the same time, the internal administration of the Spanish colonial system was undergoing changes that, while intended to strengthen and modernize it, had the paradoxical effect of further undermining the old fleet structure. The Bourbon dynasty that took the Spanish throne following the War of Succession brought with it a reforming impulse shaped by French administrative models. A desire for rationalization, efficiency, and the reduction of the endemic corruption that had characterized the Habsburg colonial system. The Casa de Contratación was moved from Seville to Cadiz in 1717, a change that reflected the shifting geography of Spanish Atlantic trade. More significantly, the rigid fleet scheduling, the twice-yearly sailings to fixed destinations at fixed times, began to give way to a system of registros sueltos, individual registered ships authorized to sail independently rather than as part of a convoy. This shift was driven partly by the declining volume of treasure available to fill convoy holds, and partly by the growing recognition that the convoy system's predictability which had been designed as a security feature, had become a vulnerability. A fleet that sailed on a known schedule to known ports was a fleet whose movements could be anticipated by anyone patient enough to watch and wait. The Registros Sueltos introduced an element of unpredictability that made interception more difficult, but they also eliminated the mutual protection that the convoy system had provided, leaving individual ships more exposed to the kind of opportunistic attack that had always been a feature of Caribbean sailing. The golden age of piracy that flourished in the early decades of the 18th century, the Nassau-based Brotherhood of Blackbeard and his contemporaries, was itself partly a consequence of these transitional pressures. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession had left thousands of sailors and privateers without employment, their letters of marque expired, and their skills finding no legitimate market in the sudden peace. Many of them drifted into outright piracy, and the Caribbean, with its complex geography of islands and shallow waters and poorly policed coasts, absorbed them readily. The shift away from the convoy system meant that more ships were sailing individually, making them more accessible targets. But the nature of piracy was also changing. The great strategic raids on colonial ports, in the manner of Drake and Morgan, were no longer viable in a world where the major European powers had settled into a more stable diplomatic equilibrium. The pirates of the early 18th century were smaller in ambition than their predecessors, working the margins of Atlantic trade rather than challenging the system itself. And then, with a decisiveness that the gradual decline of the fleet system had not quite prepared observers to expect, came the end of the golden age of piracy. And with it, the final dismantling of the conditions that had made the treasure fleet so central to the Atlantic world. Britain, France, and Spain, in a moment of shared commercial interest that briefly overrode their habitual rivalry, began to crack down on Caribbean piracy with a seriousness that previous generations had rarely managed. The Royal Navy deployed significant forces to the region. Nassau was brought under effective British colonial governance, its population of pirates given the choice between a royal pardon and a rope. The pardons were accepted by many. Those who refused, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Bartholomew Roberts, were hunted down and dealt with publicly, their execution serving as the kind of theatrical deterrence that was, in the 18th century, considered essential to the communication of state power. Roberts, the most successful pirate of the era by any measure, having captured over 400 ships during his career, was killed in action off the coast of West Africa in 1722. His death is often taken as the symbolic close of the Golden Age, by the time of the great Bourbon reforms of the 1760s and 1770s. The Reglamento de Libre Comercio of 1778, which formally opened Spanish colonial trade to multiple Spanish ports and effectively abolished what remained of the old Seville monopoly. The treasure fleet system, as it had existed in its classic form, was already a historical artifact. The twice-yearly convoys, the flota and the galleones, the great gatherings at Havana, the warehouses of Portobello thundering with the energy of a fair that could transform a swamp town into the richest marketplace on earth for a few electric weeks. All of this had faded, replaced by a more dispersed, more flexible, and considerably less dramatic system of Atlantic commerce. The last official treasure fleet in the classic sense sailed in 1778. It was a quiet ending for something that had been, at its height, one of the most consequential logistical enterprises in human history. No storm consumed it, no pirate took it. It simply ceased to be necessary, which is perhaps the most peaceful ending available to a system built on so much violence. The wealth it had carried across the ocean for nearly 2 centuries had reshaped the world. It had financed wars and cathedrals and universities and palaces. It had driven inflation across Europe, enriched merchants in a dozen countries, and built cities on both sides of the Atlantic whose foundations rested, more literally than is comfortable to contemplate, on the labor of people who had no choice about the role they played. The tree had finally fallen, and the forest, as forests always do, was already growing up around the space it left behind. Some things end, others simply change form. The Spanish treasure fleet, as a living system, as a twice-yearly rhythm of departure and arrival, of silver loaded and silver delivered, of cannon fire and hurricane season, and the long anxious wait in Havana harbor. That ended, gradually, then completely, in the way that most large things end. But the treasure fleet, as an idea, as a presence in the human imagination, as a set of questions about wealth and power and the price of empire, that has never ended at all. It simply moved, like the silver itself once did, from one vessel to another. The most immediate legacy of the fleet system was economic, and its effects rippled outward from Spain in ways that touched virtually every corner of the early modern world. The silver of Potosi did not stay in Spain. It could not. Spain spent it almost as fast as it arrived. On the Army of Flanders, on the great naval campaigns, on the servicing of debts that accumulated with a momentum of their own. The silver moved through Spain and out into Europe, and from Europe into the trade networks that connected the continent to Asia, to Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, to China, where Spanish silver coins were so trusted and so ubiquitous that they functioned as a de facto international currency for decades. The piece of 8, the real de a ocho, was legal tender in the United States until 1857. The global economy of the modern world was shaped, in ways still traceable by economic historians, by the sheer volume of silver that the treasure fleet moved across the Atlantic over 2 centuries. The inflation it caused, the trade it enabled, the financial instruments it made necessary, the institutions it built, and the institutions it destroyed. The physical legacy is quieter and more intimate. It lives at the bottom of the sea. The wrecks of the treasure fleet are scattered across an enormous arc of the Western Atlantic and Caribbean, in the shallow waters of the Florida Keys, along the treasure coast, in the Bahama Banks, off the coasts of Bermuda and the Carolinas, deep in the Caribbean itself. Some have been found and excavated, their contents lifted into museums and private collections, and the subject of legal battles that have stretched across decades. Others remain where they settled, in sand, in coral, in depths that make them accessible only to the most sophisticated modern technology. They are, in a sense, the most honest archive the treasure fleet left behind, untouched by the editing of official records, uncorrupted by the retrospective justifications of victors, just the objects themselves, resting in the dark water. The silver coins, the gold chains, the navigational instruments, the personal effects of people who did not survive to retrieve them. The cultural legacy is perhaps the most durable of all, because it operates in the imagination rather than in the archive, and the imagination is not subject to the kind of decay that takes everything else. The treasure fleet gave the world the template for the pirate story, the great ship, the hidden wealth, the desperate chase, the moment of boarding, and the clash of steel. It gave us the language of maritime adventure that runs from the novels of Robert Louis Stevenson through to the films that continue to fill cinema screens in the 21st century. The black flag, the treasure map, the island, the fortune waiting for whoever is brave enough or ruthless enough to take it. These images did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from the specific historical reality of the Caribbean in the 16th and 17th centuries, from the specific existence of the treasure fleet and the specific men who preyed upon it, and they have proven so resonant, so endlessly retellable, that they have outlasted the empire that generated them by 3 centuries, and show no signs of fading. What does it mean, finally, that we are still drawn to this story? Perhaps it is simply the scale of it, the sheer human drama of that much wealth moving through that much danger across that much ocean for that many years. Perhaps it is the moral complexity, the way the story refuses to resolve into simple heroism or simple villainy, the way the privateer and the pirate and the Spanish admiral and the enslaved diver are all implicated in the same system, all subject to the same indifferent forces of wind and greed and political calculation. Or perhaps it is something simpler still. Perhaps we are drawn to the image of the galleon, riding low in the water, heavy with the weight of the world, moving slowly across an open sea toward a horizon that promises either safe harbor or catastrophe. Because it feels, in some way that is difficult to articulate precisely, like a true image of something, of the way wealth moves through history, of the way empires carry their own weight until they cannot carry it anymore, of the way the sea, ultimately, keeps its own accounts. The treasure is still down there, some of it anyway, resting quietly in the dark water, where the current moves over it like time itself, patient, indifferent, and in no particular hurry to give anything back.